We're looking at Luke, and Luke is basically a story about Jesus. And as we've encountered different groups, right? As we've gone through it, we've got Jesus as the focus, the protagonist, the one who drives the story. But we have other groups that are reacting to it. And I was wondering, as we've gone through these 8.5 chapters, we've got disciples that are following him, right? And how do, based on the way Luke has shaped his story, how do the disciples view Jesus?
As their leader and teacher.
Okay, the disciples view Jesus as leader and teacher. Would you say they have faith in him? Faith meaning trust. Do you think they have faith in him?
I do.
The disciples? Okay.
Well, I think they're surprised about a lot of things.
Okay. So yes, to a point,
Right.
but they seem to be surprised by things. And we're going to see today a good example of them being surprised as Luke kind of moves into another part of the story. So we have disciples. We've also talked about crowds, right? And how do the crowd seem to see Jesus?
As a healer.
Okay, crowd see him as a healer. Crowd see him as... So he heals, which is always nice.
Maybe a
And
prophet.
they follow
Prophet.
him. They follow
Right.
him a lot that don't understand the
Okay.
parables, which is surprising that.
The disciples, so that may be a difference. Was the dog there to greet you?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, she came in. Because I think I'm going to close the door.
Is she
so
mad at you all
doesn't-
because Shelley's not here?
She's-
I have nothing for you.
None of us did. Or did
Yes.
you have a treat? No.
Well, just leave your purses on the floor. She'll go through it. She'll find something. Even if it's just Kleenex.
I'm gonna say, even if it's just Kleenex.
She'll be delighted.
Here she is.
That's,
I don't know what I always got in there.
so, okay, so we the crowds are there, but they don't seem to understand. But they're there. What about the Jewish leaders, scribes, Pharisees? They don't like it. Why don't they like it?
Because he said he's the son of
Because
God.
he's not.
Okay, they're afraid, would appear to be afraid of them, or what does Luke say the reason is they don't like him? What does Luke, I guess what does Luke, how does Luke want to see us, the reader or the hearer of his story? How does he want us to view those scribes and Pharisees, those Jewish leaders?
Follow the law.
Okay, they follow the law.
And Jesus isn't following the law.
Okay, remember and I'll go back to this because I think this is important for in Luke. Remember, Jesus breaks the law, but remember how Luke phrases his breaking that last time he breaks the Sabbath law, because his disciples pick grain, harvested on the Sabbath, and he hangs out with sinners and tax collectors, and they've misunderstood him at least twice. When he says your sins are forgiven, they assume he's forgiving sins, which he isn't. He's doing what he was called to do. He's announcing forgiveness, not actually forgiving himself. But remember the man with the withered hand whom he heals on the Sabbath. Do you remember the question Jesus asked when they were grumbling within themselves, and Jesus, because we the reader know, because the writer tells us, do you remember why Jesus asked them a question before he heals the man that they don't answer?
Is it lawful to do good or to do evil?
Okay, is it lawful to do good or evil on the Sabbath? Is it lawful to do good or evil? And they won't answer him. And Jesus does what?
Jesus does good.
He does good. He does good by healing the man, right? Which and I don't think this is an accident, the affliction of the man is something that could have been done in 8 hours. His hand wasn't going to be more withered if Jesus had waited a day and done it outside of the Sabbath. It's not like his life was in jeopardy. It wasn't like the servant of the centurion, who was sick, and could have well died. That wasn't the case. Jesus could have waited a day. He could have waited a month and healed him, and the man still would have been healed. And still Jesus would have obeyed the law. And that's why the phrasing is so important. Is it to do good? Is the intention of the law good or evil? And he does good, and the Pharisees, scribes and Pharisees, hate him because of it. That's when they decide, we're going to kill him. And I think that's Luke telling his audience as clear as he can. These scribes and Pharisees are bad news. Bad news. So anyway, they are just bad. These scribes and Pharisees. Like I said, no Nicodemus here in Luke. Who a Pharisee that changes and grows. Okay, and so that's how the leaders see Jesus. They really dislike him. How do we, the reader, see Jesus? Because all these other people are in the story, right? But we're not. We're kind of looking down on the story, right? Because we know things, we've heard things, we've seen things that the people in the story don't know, haven't heard, haven't seen. How does Luke want us to see Jesus? Based on what he's written to this point.
That's good.
Okay, he wants us to see Jesus as good, someone who does good. Right? Okay, so that's certainly part of how Luke wants us to see. What else?
Son of God.
Okay, we know he's the Son of God, something no person in the story has said yet. Demons have said it, but nobody in the story has said it yet, that he's the Son of God. So, but we know that. How do we know that? How do we know he's Son of God?
The Bible tells us.
Well, the Bible does, but how do we, you're right, how do we right here, chapter 8 of Luke, know that he's the Son of God?
Luke told the story of the baptism.
Okay, remember at the baptism, the voice from heaven says, you are my beloved Son, and you I am well pleased. Something said to Jesus, but who hears it? We do, because Luke writes it. So we hear the voice from heaven saying, you're the Son. We also heard this little encounter between Mary and Gabriel. We were like behind the bushes listening to this conversation. That nobody else was there but just Mary and Gabriel and us. So we know this information. So Luke has given us stuff to sort of guide us. So as people react to who he is, we already know who he is. And I think that's relatively important, because we then can judge the people in the story, their reactions based on what we already know about it. Okay, and I think Luke is too good a writer not to be aware that that's what he's doing. So he wants us, the reader, to be kind of almost judging in this story. And I've often thought, when you read the gospel story, you look at this and you say, well, why didn't they get it? Like I think, Patty, you said with the crowds, why didn't they get it? Why didn't they get it? Well, because we know a whole lot about Jesus that the crowds don't know, because we've heard it and they haven't. So, and I think that's Luke would say, I did my job. That's exactly what I want you to be saying as you read about the crowds, or the disciples for that matter. Okay, so we're in chapter 8. Now Jesus is still in Galilee. Luke is going to tell us when he starts moving to Jerusalem, and that's going to be sort of the pivotal move, and that's going to happen pretty soon. We've already talked about some of the work he's accomplished and the reception he's received. And outside of the scribes and the Pharisees, how has Jesus been received? What's been the reception? It's been pretty good reception. I mean, the crowds are following the disciples. He's given the disciples a lot of instruction, which is good for us because it kind of flows through them to us, on what to expect. So we've got all of that. We've got him having taught lessons. We know what he's about. We've seen him heal and cast out demons. Okay. Now, we're moving to a point where Peter's going to do something we'll talk about next week. We're not there yet. It's going to be one of those hinges on which the story turns, and it's going to shift in its focus after Peter makes his confession at Caesarea Philippi. But it appears as though Luke, the evangelist, is still kind of preparing us for what Peter is going to say. In other words, establishing Jesus' authority. And we've got his teaching, because how do people respond to his teaching? Seems to be pretty consistent. Even the scribes and the Pharisees, how do they respond to his teaching? What are the words that Luke uses when Jesus teaches something? How do people, and teaching includes the healing and casting out of demons, how do people tend to respond to that? Luke says they are amazed. They are amazed or astonished, depending on your translation. So the people are astonished by it. What Luke seems to be doing, until we get to this confession, is still building up Jesus' authority. What does Jesus have the power to do? And he continues that in chapter 8, beginning in verse 22. See, Shelley has to deal with that all the time.
She saw a Kleenex.
Yeah,
So
that's what she'll do.
We're hiding it.
But she still won't cross that line. She will not cross that table line. Okay, so we've got him having done all this kind of stuff. What happens in chapter 8, verse 22?
They're out and about.
Okay, they're out and about.
Jesus falls
Out and
asleep.
about. Okay, and where are they out and about? Okay, they get into a boat, right? And he is with his disciples.
And disciples, the 12, or the apostles, or disciples, is it a group of people?
Janet, that's an excellent question. And if we were reading Mark or Matthew, you'd say, gosh, I don't know. Because both of them use disciples and apostles almost interchangeably. In the Gospel of Luke, remember, disciples are that subset. So if he means apostles, he would have said apostles. Okay. So he's with disciples, and when you think about it, there are a lot of disciples.
That's what I was to say. How big is this Bible?
Yeah, there's a lot of disciples. Which means, because remember, Luke is shaping this story. So he's not all that, he's not like this impartial reporter. Jesus got in a boat with 7 people. Writing this stuff down. He's with his followers, which means whenever we run into disciples, how do you think Luke wants us, the reader, to react to a story that involves disciples? When Jesus does something with them, more particularly when Jesus speaks to disciples, how do you think Luke wants us to react?
It seems like when he says disciples, it's a crowd. It always seems to be a crowd.
Okay, a lot of people, but with us, the reader, how does he want us to read? Do you think he wants us to say, to step aside and, that's really interesting? Is that the way you think he wants us to react? Yes, I think that is exactly right. When Luke has Jesus doing something with disciples, in a sense, we're there too. What he says applies to us. And in fact, we saw last week when he gave the parables, those parables last week, in particular the parable of the sower, You know, the disciples, when he gave it, I got to believe they were thinking, so? Because, he's here, he's doing what do you mean? So and so, what? What are we talking about? Doesn't make any sense to them. But for us, it makes a lot of sense. That parable is for us. The people at his time, they don't, even though he gave an explanation, they don't sow seeds yet. But for us, Lord have mercy, makes it, and this is Luke shaping his story. So I think that's what he's doing. When he's with disciples, he's bringing us. I think he wants us to identify with the disciples. So in other words, when Jesus is getting on the boat, we're getting on the boat too. Therefore, there's something that's really important going to happen that he wants his disciples to witness, to know about. Okay, so he's on the boat, Sea of Galilee. What happens on the lake or sea? It's the same thing. What happens?
Storm comes along.
Okay. They put out, and what is Jesus doing? He's sleeping. And a storm kicks up on the lake, right? And we've talked about this before, particularly when we were doing the narrative, in Genesis. Water is a big deal in the ancient world, symbolically. You remember what water represented?
Caution?
Close. It's a C word. You're right with the first letter. You remember what it was?
Chaos.
Chaos. Water, very good.
Takes a minute.
Caution was in the neighborhood, but that was good. Remember, represented chaos. Remember Genesis 1:1. God doesn't, in Genesis, the first chapter, God doesn't create out of nothing. In the beginning was what? Water. That's why the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the deep. There was water at creation. This is a symbolic story. And it makes sense when you think of ancient people. The one thing that they couldn't control, they had a lot of things in this world they couldn't. And they attributed it to demons and other things. But you look at the sea, and man, boats go out, and usually they come back, but sometimes they don't. And, that's why they developed all these stories about sea monsters, Leviathan and Behemoth, who lived in the sea and destroyed ships and the Kraken and that kind of jazz. Because the sea is mysterious. Storms kick up and take down boats, and you got no control. So it represents chaos. And remember, at creation, God brings order out of chaos, creates that little bubble of sky and land. In the midst of the waters, that's why the flood is so important. God releases his protection and chaos reestablishes itself. But here, when they're going out on the sea, an ancient person would have said, this isn't just a sea story. There's something more going on. So Jesus is on the sea. They're facing a storm on the sea. This wonderful symbol of chaos. What do the disciples do?
They're scared to death and they wake Jesus.
They wake him up and they say to him,
We're going to drown.
yeah, we're going to drown. This is bad news. Now, if Luke wants us on that boat too, in a sense, when we see those disciples, those people who've been listening and following Jesus saying, Jesus, you got to wake up, we're going to drown here. What do we think? How do we evaluate the question, that statement the disciples made? Jesus, wake up, we're going to drown. Is it an appropriate statement for them to make? Based on what we know?
I'd say yes.
Well, based on what we know he's what?
Son of
Son of
God.
God.
Son of God.
So it's not going to happen.
But he's sleeping.
Yeah, that's right, he's sleeping.
Even though he's the son of God, he's sleeping.
Okay.
So he might not be aware that there's a storm.
Okay, well, maybe. Well, let's go with that. Let's see how Luke interprets this. So they wake him up. What does he do?
Makes the wind stop.
He makes the wind. Now, symbolically, this is really important. Because if water is this symbol of chaos, what does Jesus do?
He controls it.
He controls it. And he controls it by
Speaking.
speaking. And why is that particularly important?
That just doesn't really happen.
Genesis 1:1. Chaotic beginning, right?
Right.
And how is that bubble created?
Word.
Word. God speaks, right? God commands. It's not like Genesis 2, where God gets in the dirt and forms a little person out of the clay. You know, God says, what? Let there be light. And there's light. And God said, let there be dry land. And there's dry land. And let there be sky. And there's sky. He speaks it and commands it. And what is Jesus doing? In the midst of that chaos, what is Jesus doing here?
Same thing.
The same thing. He's doing the exact same thing God did in creation. The exact same thing God did in creation. So we, the reader, now can appreciate something about Jesus, that he has power. That he has this God power. Kind of fleshes out a little bit the Son of God business, right? Mm-hmm. You know, that he functions with authority. We knew he could heal, and we knew he could cast out demons, and we know demons knew him. But now he has this authority over the natural world, the same kind of authority God had over chaos. Now, if we say chaos, you know, it's not just stilling a storm, physical storm, but stilling chaos, that offers disciples some real comfort. Why might it offer disciples comfort knowing that Jesus can still chaos? Has God's authority over chaos? Why might that be particularly important for disciples?
But maybe Jesus can calm their whatever.
Alice, you nailed it. I mean, look at the prayer request we made at the beginning. Lord, have mercy. Every single person you mentioned is facing what? Chaos. Is facing chaos. Some chaos in their life. Things are happening that they don't control, that they didn't choose. And the lesson that what Jesus did with that storm over chaos is what Jesus can do in the lives of people. He has that authority over chaos. Now, to see if the disciples' initial reaction was appropriate or not, after he stills the storm, what does he say to those disciples?
Where is your faith?
Where is your faith? Which means, and remember, as Luke is shaping the story, when Jesus speaks, we believe him, right? He's not saying something we'd say, well, he didn't mean it. You know, if he says it, he meant it, and the evangelist wants us to believe. So the evangelist is saying, or Jesus, by making that statement, is saying, what about the reaction of the disciples? When they said, Master, wake up, we're going to drown.
They didn't have faith in Jesus.
They didn't have faith. Now, what is faith? We've talked about that a few times.
Not seeing something but believing in it.
Well, yeah, you're right. But remember, we said that when you look at the Greek word, pistuo, which is the verb, or pistis, which is the noun, it's generally translated with another English word. When you run into it in Scripture, but also in just any kind of Greek literature. Pistuo or pistis generally means trust. It generally means trust. And so what Jesus is saying to him, sometimes we think of faith in terms of believing things. You know, believing like doctrine or ideas. And it is kind of, but it's more like trusting. You know, it's taking all those ideas and saying, well, I'm going to take all those ideas and I'm going to make a decision to trust you. I'm going to decide that I'm going to trust you. And that's what faith is. That's what pisteuo is. It's that decision to trust. And what is then Jesus saying to the disciples?
Where's your trust?
Yeah, you didn't trust. You didn't trust. You didn't trust me. In other words, whether I woke up or not, you were not going to perish in this storm. Chaos was not going to overwhelm you. In fact, if I never stilled the storm, chaos was not going to overwhelm you. Chaos was not going to, I wasn't going to let that happen. That's the trust I want you to have. Not that I'm going to still all your storms, but I'm going to get you through them. And I think that becomes a power. That's why, Janet, were you talking about being a disciple, putting you on the boat, is so really important. Because we, the disciples on the boat, look at them and say, he's right. He's right. Trust is believing that Jesus will get us through storms. Not still them, but get us through them. Sometimes they are stilled, and that's wonderful. But sometimes they're not. But that doesn't mean we're going to perish. And therefore we can have that kind of trust. Kind of a powerful message. But I think the big thing is Jesus is establishing authority, right? And we know that that's kind of the point, because the reaction of the disciples isn't to what he said to them, where is your faith? Because if that was the point, the disciples would have said, yeah, I should have believed, or why didn't I trust? Or their reaction would have been based on that. But what after Jesus asks that question, what does Luke say the disciples do? What's going on inside of them?
Fear and amazement.
Fear and amazement. We've seen it before, right? And what is the basis of their fear and amazement?
They wonder who Jesus is.
Lord have mercy. They wonder because what? What do they recognize about Jesus that Luke really wants us to recognize about Jesus?
He can control.
He can control. He can still the storms. He can calm the waters. Bang, he's establishing authority. Now, we immediately shift. Luke has made his point. We don't need to belabor it anymore. We're going to shift to another story. Like I said, I think all three of them, we're going to run into three of them. I think all of them deal with authority. Jesus functioning with the authority of God. We already saw him stilling the storm. What's going on in verse 26?
They went to the other side of the sea.
Okay, he's gone to the other side of the sea, and they're at a place called Gennesaret, right? Or Gerasene. It's Gennesaret. Who does he meet there?
Demon-possessed man.
Okay, once he gets out of the boat, he meets a guy with a demon, right? And what is the person's condition?
Been like that for a long time.
Yeah, he's been like that a long time. He's been streaking in a cemetery.
Yeah.
He's been buck naked, as we would say down south in a cemetery. Which is a lot like my Uncle Chuck, but that's a whole nother story. No, that's not Uncle Chuck. Uncle Chuck weighed 300 pounds. He was 5 foot. He was 5'6" and weighed 300 pounds. Had a head the size of a softball. But that's another story. It has nothing to do with Jesus. No, so he's possessed by a demon. Luke is giving us proof. That this guy, you'd say, this guy, he isn't right. This guy running around buck naked in a cemetery, he ain't right. And what happens when he meets Jesus? So Jesus gets off the boat, the guy's there. What immediately happens?
He goes and falls at his feet.
Okay, he falls at his feet. And what does he say?
Why are you bothering me, Jesus, Son of God Most High?
Okay. Now, why is that statement important? That he says, and it's not him talking, it's the demon talking. Why is that? What's that? He recognizes who Jesus is. Now, does that come as a surprise to us?
No.
Heck no. We have heard this before, right? We heard it around the birth. We heard it at the baptism. We've heard other demons say it. So we know who he is, right? So again, the demon is reinforcing who Jesus is. The supernatural know, even if the people in the story don't know yet. Why did he say that? Why did he say it? Why did the demon say that to Jesus? The whole statement, don't torment me. What does Luke tell us motivated that statement?
They begged him not to order them to go.
Yeah, because he'd done it before. He tormented unclean spirits before. Cast them out. This unclean spirit knows that, right? What is the guy's background? In case we're not fully clear that this guy is nuts. What else does Luke tell us?
And he'd been chained and he had been under guard, but he broke his chains and had been driven by demons.
Now, what does that show about the demonic possession?
Powerful.
Powerful. We got something powerful going on here. All right. So, demon says, Jesus, Son of God Most High, don't torment us. Because he knows that that's what Jesus does. He kind of is a pain to demons. What does Jesus say to the demon?
What is your name?
Okay, ask for name, and what is the response?
Legion.
Oh, that's Legion. Because, that's like horror movie stuff. Legion, his head was spinning around. And, he was vomiting up pea soup. My name is Legion because
I'm many.
I am many. Okay. Now, what does the demon fear? Or what does the demonic fear?
The abyss.
Okay, fears the abyss, oblivion,
Translation.
right? And by fearing that, the demonic, or the demons, or the demon, or however you want to say, recognize that Jesus has power over them, that he can consign them to the abyss, to oblivion. Now, Luke tells us what's present, hanging around.
Pigs.
You got a herd of pigs. Now, pigs, kind of a loaded thing. For Jews, pigs are not
Clean.
clean, and you say, well, why are there pigs here? Well, this is Galilee. He's not in Judea. He's in Galilee, and Galilee they call it the Galilee of the nations. It's a mixed population. So you had a lot of people that weren't bothered by pigs. But I think primarily Luke doesn't want us to worry about that. Luke is more concerned but this is a herd of unclean animals that's out there, right? Now, what does the demon want?
To go into the pigs.
The demons want to go into the pigs, right? Mm-hmm. And this herd of unclean animals. So what does Jesus do?
Let them.
That's what he said.
Let them.
He lets them go, right? And what happens?
They run down the bank into the lake and were drowned.
And we're drowned. Now, what has happened then to the demons? By having them go into the herd of pigs, run into the lake, and drown. What's happened to the demons?
They're gone. No.
Well, again, if we look at water as this symbol of chaos, what's happened to the demons?
They're back in chaos.
They're back in chaos. They've returned to chaos. They're not in the abyss. They're not they aren't destroyed, but they have returned to chaos. Which again, is kind of a lesson for disciples, that it's not a question of destruction, it's a matter of sending them where they are, where they belong. And they belong in chaos. That's where they belong. Now, who witnesses all this? You got swine herders, right? And what do? After they witness these demons go into the herd of pigs run into the water. Yeah, I don't think with this, I've heard people say, well, the demons were destroyed. They were destroyed. Well, no, they weren't. They weren't destroyed. But they did return to the water. They did return to chaos. But they didn't. Jesus, in a sense, gave them what they wanted. They wanted to be in the herd of pigs, and he put them in a herd of pigs. and they returned to chaos, but they weren't afflicting the man anymore. The man was saved. And so the swineherders go and tell everybody, people come, what do the people say when they come?
The man that is now dressed and in his right mind.
In his right mind, he's clothed, he's drinking a cup of tea, talking to Jesus about the weather. He is in his right mind. Now, how does this compare to the first description?
Total opposite.
The first description is he's running around buck naked, in a cemetery, and now he's dressed and very rational. And how do they react? Of course, how do they react? They were afraid. We've seen that before. And what do?
They asked Jesus to go away.
Okay, they asked Jesus to leave. Why would they want him to leave? Why would they ask Jesus to leave?
Because he hated bacon.
What's that?
Things are their financial.
Well, Jesus has gotten in the way of their finance, have damaged their income. What else has Jesus done?
Well, they would be afraid with all that power that he would.
Okay.
They don't know what he would do
He
to them, maybe.
he has a lot of power. So power over them in a lot of ways. He's screwed up their economy. What else can he screw up? I mean, he can call demons out of people. That's pretty dramatic. And so what does Jesus do? He got into the boat and left. Now, what does the healed man, the man who once had the demons, what does he want?
He wants to go with Jesus.
He wants to go with Jesus. And what does Jesus tell him? Go back to your family and do what?
Tell everyone what God
Proclaim.
Okay, proclaim everything God has done for you, right? Now, to whom is Jesus directing the man's attention? When the man says, can I go with you? Jesus says, no, go home and tell everybody about this wonderful thing that God has done, or the wonderful things that God has done for you. On what is Jesus focusing the man's attention?
Jesus.
God. Focus his attention on God, right? Tell everyone what God has done for you, right? Okay. And so what does the man do?
He doesn't.
Does he?
Oh.
Doesn't say.
Mine says he went away and told all the time like Jesus had done.
Tells everybody what?
Okay, I didn't pick up on that.
Yeah, what Jesus has done for him. In other words, the man doesn't do what Jesus told him to do. Which shows us what?
He didn't have faith in God, he was putting his faith in Jesus, the
Now,
man.
remember on the boat, Jesus saying, what's wrong with your faith? And they are amazed he stilled the water, but they don't talk about why they didn't have faith. They don't discuss among themselves, yeah, he's right. We should have trusted him. We didn't need to wake him up. He would have led us through. They don't do that because the disciples don't understand yet. But then how could they? Because they're living on the wrong side of the cross and the empty tomb, so they can't understand who he is. They're reacting the way they're supposed to. Same thing is going on here. This guy had the demons cast out. Jesus says, now imagine Jesus comes up to you and says, this is what I want you to say. I want you to talk about the glory of God. And you say, okay. And then you run off and say, man, that guy, look at that guy over there. He can do great things. If Jesus tells us to talk about God, what are we going to do?
Talk about God.
We're going to talk about God. Yeah, but I really want to talk about Jesus. We're going to do what? We're going to talk about God, if Jesus tells us to. If we understand who Jesus is which this guy
Then
doesn't. This guy doesn't.
And mine says too, like, return to your home and declare how much God has done for you. And then, so he went away proclaiming throughout the city. So he didn't even go home.
He didn't even go home. He did nothing that Jesus told him to do. Nothing. There's a story, a parallel story in Mark, where something very similar.
Did he have a home?
Well, something very similar. And Jesus tells the man, and I think it was a demonic, don't tell anybody what happened. Don't tell anybody what happened. And the next verse says, the man went and told everybody. And then the next verse says, and so many people came to be healed that Jesus had to leave. And I think both of them are kind of making the same point. It's not that, and again, I've read commentators, and they may be right. Heck, I don't know. I'm interpreting it as best I can. That have said, well, the word is so powerful that it's got to get out. And the man is associating Jesus with God, and that's appropriate. Well, it's not appropriate. I don't think it's appropriate yet. Not for people in the story to be doing it. I think this shows the same thing we saw in the first story. That the disciples didn't understand who Jesus was. Therefore, they didn't question their faith. This guy doesn't understand who Jesus was. If he had, he'd have done what Jesus told him to do, and he didn't do it. He didn't do it. Even though we say, oh, well, he did better. No, he didn't. Because better is what? What is the better road?
what he was told to
Do what you're told. If Jesus tells you to do it, do it. Don't try to improve it. Okay, so we've got, but another, we the reader know what? Jesus has authority over chaos, over storms. Jesus has authority over demons. Establishing his authority. Story number 3. Ooh, 3's always good. What happens to Jesus? And he's on the lake. He's crossing the lake again. What happens when he returns?
A crowd welcome.
Okay, we got a crowd welcoming him. Okay, and crowd is always good, because they're sort of there. And who comes up to him? Jairus. And Jairus is identified as leader of the synagogue. Now, interesting, Luke has chosen not to call him a scribe or a Pharisee. Because I don't think he wants us to see scribes and Pharisees as good. But Jairus the leader of the synagogue, comes up to him and does what?
Fell at his feet.
Falls at his feet, sign of worship. Then,
tells him he has a sick daughter.
got a sick daughter. I want you to do what? I want you to come to my house. I want you to come to my house because I got a daughter, a little girl, 12 years old, who's dying. And so Jesus goes, right? Is going with it. And as he's going, what happens?
The crowd's
Okay, crowd is pressed on, up against him. Now, we have what's called an inclusion. And that's when you have a big story and a little story in the middle. And usually when writers use that, they're connecting that little story to the big story. So we're not talking about radically different. They kind of have the same point. He's reinforcing the point he's trying to make by the big one. So we got this little inclusion, this little story in the middle. And as he's going through the crowd, what happens? Who's in the crowd? Okay. There's a woman who's had a hemorrhage for 12 years, for crying out loud. And what more of the backstory does Luke give us? She's had this hemorrhage for 12 years. Nobody can heal her, even though she's going to doctors. Now, why would this hemorrhage be particularly important? I mean, we've had withered hands before, we've had lame people. But why might a hemorrhage?
Unclean.
Yes, that's right. Unclean. Because remember, the Jews associated life with blood. The life, the Spirit of God dwelt in the blood. And so if you were messing with blood, that made you unclean, because blood was kind of sacred, and you're not supposed to touch it. You're not supposed to be around it. So this made sure that she was, not only was she unclean for 12 years, but anybody who touched her was unclean. So this woman was isolated, right? And the fact that she was in a crowd meant the people in the crowd didn't know, because she by her nature was unclean and had been unclean. What does she do? She touches. Does she touch him?
No.
No, just his clothes. And what happens to her when she touches?
Bleeding stops.
Okay, the bleeding stops. Now, how does Jesus respond? So we've got this healing that has spiritual components, because all of a sudden, now, for the first time in 12 years, she is no longer unclean. She's no longer unclean. How does Jesus respond?
You touched me.
Yeah.
Okay, he touched you. Who touched me? And Peter says,
So many are around you.
who could have done it? And the fact that so how would we know? And Jesus said, somebody touched me because I felt power go out, which tells us Jesus has power, and he knows it. What does the woman say?
She was afraid.
Okay, she was afraid, and falling down before him, which is a position of worship. What does she say?
She told him that she had been hurt and touched him.
Okay,
And she was instantly healed.
and was immediately healed. And what does Jesus say to her? Yeah, and if we take faith the way the word is in Greek, what made her well? Trust. That she trusted what? That Jesus could do it. She trusted that Jesus could do it, and
He did.
he did. Okay, so it was that trust. Now, why does that make sense on even a very basic level? Why would her faith, the fact that she trusted that Jesus could heal her, why did that result in her being made well? If she hadn't trusted Jesus could heal her, what?
She may not have been there.
She may not have been there. And if she was there, she sure wouldn't have,
Touched him.
fought her way through the crowds to touch him. If she did. So the fact that she trusted him moved her to do these things that resulted in
Her healing.
her healing. It was her trust that did that. Her decision to trust. Okay, so we now know, based on this little inclusion, that somehow the Jairus story is about trust. And all of a sudden, Jairus coming up to Jesus and saying, "Come to my house, my daughter is sick," that tells us Jairus' motivation without the writer having to say it. Why does Jairus ask Jesus to come to his house? In fact, you said it. When you said, even though it's not in the text, you said he wanted Jesus to heal his daughter. He just says, my daughter's dying. Please come to my house. But we know it has to do with Jairus' trust. And if we had any doubt, the woman sort of establishes it in this little story. So we're out of the story of the woman. We're back to the Jairus story. What happens as he is speaking to the woman?
They came and said that the daughter had died.
The daughter had died, therefore
He didn't know that.
didn't need to. Now notice they call him teacher. Which, is Jesus a teacher?
Yes.
Yeah. Is Jesus more than a teacher? Yes. So teacher is often a title, and all the evangelists use this, is often a title used when the person doesn't really fully understand who Jesus is. When Nicodemus comes at night in John 3, he calls him teacher, rabbi, which shows Nicodemus really doesn't know who he is. he's not completely out of the, he doesn't think he's nobody, but he certainly doesn't understand the whole Jesus. Okay, so teacher no longer needs to come. When Jesus heard this, what does he say? Okay, don't be afraid. Okay, believe, which is trust, right? And
She will be well.
she will be saved. The Greek word is sunso, which is a broad word. I mean, it can mean wholeness. Therefore, it can mean healing. It can also be spiritual wholeness. So it's a word that covers a lot of territory. Okay? And that's the word Jesus is using here. She's going to be made whole. She's going to be saved. She's going to be changed as a result. Okay. Now, Jesus comes, gets to the house, right? Okay. Enters, but who goes with him?
Peter.
Okay, Peter, John, and James, sort of this inner group, the three. Poor Andrew, Peter's brother, he's left out. Andrew never does anything. It's Peter, James, and John. So that's the way it goes. And John always gets the last billing. Are you comfortable? Okay. We're good. We'll have cheese and carrots later. Okay. Now what happens? So he gets in the house. He takes Peter, James, and John, and the mom and dad. And what's the situation?
Everyone's crying.
Now everybody's crying. Now what does it seem as though? Again, Luke is shaping this story. What does he really want us to know? What does he want us? How does he want us to see this scene? What does he want us to know?
It sounds like she was dead.
She really is dead. That she really is dead. I mean, it's not like, people are crying. They're getting ready for a funeral. Right. They know she's dead. Now, what does Jesus say?
She's not dead, but asleep.
She's not dead, but asleep. Now, the fact that he uses sleep is really, really interesting, because in ancient Palestine, sleep is often used as a euphemism for death. That's why in Paul's letter he talks about those who have fallen asleep. He doesn't mean those who have dozed off. When he says the saints who have fallen asleep, he's talking about those who have died. Because understand, ancient Jews believed that death was like sleep. The whole person. They didn't see death as a time when souls departed and had independent existence somewhere else. They believed it was like being asleep. Wasn't identical to being, but like being asleep. And at the resurrection, what happened? If when you died, you fell asleep, what happened at the resurrection of the dead?
Woke up.
Boom, you woke up. God woke you up. And that's the way the ancient Jews, because remember I told you Jews didn't believe that bodies could exist without souls or souls without bodies. Therefore, when you died, it was like falling asleep. At the resurrection, God woke you up and you rose body and soul. So you had this new existence. So when he uses sleep, there's a certain irony in it, because sleep is this euphemism for death. So ancient people would have picked it out. It's not as important to us because it just isn't. In fact, it might even mislead us into believing that the girl really wasn't dead, but she really was asleep. But she's dead, because how do the people respond when he says she's only asleep? They laughed. They made fun of him. So when he said, so they weren't taking it as a euphemism. They were taking it as she's actually asleep. And what does Jesus do?
Takes her hand and tells her to wake up.
He takes her hand and tells her to get up. Now, significant that he says, get up.
She's laying down dead.
Well, she's laying down dead. Again, what did he do when he stilled the storm? He commanded the wind and the sea, right?
Right.
What is he doing here?
Command.
Commanding the same thing. You know, again, this is kind of a godlike thing. And when he says, child, get up, if there was any question that she was dead, what does Luke tell us?
She immediately stood up.
Well, even before that,
Her spirit returned.
her spirit returned. Remember, and I think I've mentioned it before, the ancient Jews believed that spirit from God, the Ruach, the Pneuma, which that God breathed into Adam, enabled Adam to live. Adam went from being a little mud man to a living being because God breathed the spirit in. If you have the spirit of God, you're living. When you die, it's not your soul that leaves, it's God's spirit leaves. You know, God's spirit leaves and you cease to be a living being because it's the spirit that energizes body and soul. It's God's spirit that enabled Adam to live. It's God's spirit that enables us to live. And the Jews believed, because they weren't stupid, they believed that the spirit sort of hung around a person for a while. You know, in fact, they said 3 days. That's why 3 days is such a big deal. That's why Jesus coming to Lazarus in John after 3 days is a big deal, because they believed the spirit hung around for 3 days and could re-enter the person because of within that time. Well, it's because medically, you know, they declared a lot of people dead who weren't. You know, so if they said, oh, that guy's dead, you know, the family said, let's give it 3 days before we do anything. You know, let's wait 3 days, because I've known people that looked dead that really weren't. You know, they sort of came back.
They even buried dead people. That's why they have the ring the bell. They used to tie a bell to someone's finger in the grave. And if they woke up in the grave and they rang the bell, that's what they were listening for.
And you know, it's amazing. This was an idea that was present about 200 years ago, less than 200 years ago. Edgar Allan Poe, one of his stories is the premature burial. And the whole premise of the story is a man who was obsessed with being buried and not being dead. You know, appearing to be dead because he wasn't breathing. You know, and that's, if you determine whether you're alive or not by whether there's a stain on a mirror when you put it underneath your nose, you could end up in a hole. There's a lot of things associated with, you know, the whole idea of vampires, the living dead, had to do with digging up people and finding the inside of that casket with fingernail scratches. Well, they must have come back to life. No, they didn't come back to life. When you put them in the hole, they were still alive and trying to fight their way out. You know, so it's the idea. That's why the Jews believed the spirit lingered for 3 days. Look, if he's laying on that slab for 3 days, hadn't moved, call the undertaker. You know, it's time to put him in a hole. That's why it was so important. And that's the idea of Jesus was buried so quickly because of the Sabbath. You couldn't handle dead bodies on the Sabbath. So they got him in a hole too fast. Faster than they would ordinarily. Because you couldn't do that. Didn't want to handle bodies on the Sabbath. So anyway, she gets up. The spirit re-enters her. She gets up. We know she's alive because he says what?
Give her something.
Give her something to eat, which is a pretty good indication that we're not talking about a ghost. You know, it's not some sort of weird thing going on. You know, the kid's hungry. Give her something to eat. And what's the response?
Her parents were astonished.
Okay, the parents were astonished. And we have seen that word before. They were astonished, but then Jesus said what?
Don't tell.
Don't tell anybody what happened. Now, we've encountered this now over and over again. Why would Jesus say, don't tell anybody? You'd think he'd be saying, tell everybody. Lord have mercy. Talk about a crusade. You're going to draw all kinds of people if this gets out. Why would he say, don't tell anybody?
He wants to be known as the Son of God, not a miracle worker.
And the Son of God means more than just being able to still storms, cast out demons, and heal folks. If that's how you see Jesus, that's part. You're seeing him in part, but you're not seeing the whole thing. And I think that's the reason that we've got to wait a little while. Because the Son of God is not just this spectacular, powerful healer, but the Son of God is also who? Who else is the Son of God?
Our Savior.
The Savior who has to then has to die on the cross. He's got to be the one that dies on the cross. Yeah. So the Son of God is the one who also suffers. The Son of God is the Son of Man as well. Yeah.
Do you think he also kind of, I don't know, but it seems to me he would be protective of the girl, like everybody's going to want to come see her too, and overwhelm.
Yeah, that could very well be the case, that she would cease to have a normal life, that her life would forever change. Yeah, that's a good point. That could be involved in it too, as well. Now, we got 3 stories. What's the point of those 3 stories? What's the point of the 3 stories?
Trust? No.
What's that?
Trust? I don't know.
Well, okay, trust in what?
Trust in God.
Okay, we got trust in God. What about God and Jesus do we see in those 3? Because think about the stories. We got the first story, Jesus does what? Still calms us home. Second story, he does what?
Cast out demons.
Third story, he does what?
Same.
He heals and even resuscitates, somebody. What do we know about Jesus that we may not have known before? This guy has
Power.
He has power. This guy has power. And we can trust in it. We can trust in it. They don't yet. They will. But we can trust in it. Okay. This is, I think, and part of the reason he's doing it is what we're going to see. We're coming up to. Because, like I said, there's a pivotal point coming up in Luke. And in fact, it's the hinge on which Matthew and Mark also turn. That's coming up. The whole tone of the gospel is going to change after something occurs, and we'll look at it next week. And so next week we're going to look at Luke 9:1 through 27. 9:1 through 27, and Luke is still establishing Jesus's authority. Any questions? Some powerful stories, and I think that's not only does it show authority, but it also shows the appropriate response to this authority, and that's trust. That's trust. Okay, then let's have a word of prayer. Lord God, thank you so much for guiding us through this. Remind us that not only does Jesus have authority, that he has power. He has power over chaos. He has power over the supernatural. He has power over disease, even power over death. That he does have authority, your authority. Remind us, though, that we can also make the decision to trust in it. And as our lives get a little bit chaotic, and as we feel controlled by things that seem beyond us, and when life just plain gets hard, remind us that the one we worship does have this authority to get us through. Just remind and enable us to trust. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Good. Thank you.